Hello again, it's me, Matthew Chalmers from The Liberator. This is a place where we talk about the past and the present in order to feel more connected with the rest of sentient life on the planet, other human beings, and other animals. Today I want to talk about the top 5 greatest names in history. Now, there is no objective criteria for what makes a great name. This is just names I like the sound of. Either they sound goofy, or imposing, impressive, or maybe I just like the way it rolls off the tongue. So without further ado, let's talk about the top 5 greatest names in history, in my opinion. Starting things off, we have Xenophon. Xenophon was an Athenian general, historian, philosopher, and economist. He was a disciple of Socrates and wrote many works, including Socratic dialogues, but what I really want to talk about today is his Anabasis, or sometimes called the Expedition of Cyrus, from 401 BC. Essentially, it's the most remarkable adventure story to survive from the ancient world. So, there was a Persian prince called Cyrus the Younger, whose brother, Artaxerxes II, was the king of Persia. But Cyrus fancied having a stab at taking the throne for himself, and so hired 10,000 Greek mercenaries to come campaigning with him all the way to Babylon to try and take over the Persian Empire. Now, the Greeks were led to Babylon on false pretenses. They thought they were helping destroy some insurgent tribal groups within the empire, but Cyrus essentially lied to them, and eventually the Greeks did cotton on that they were going to fight the Persian king. Eventually the two sides meet at a place called Cunaxa, quite near the city of Babylon, in southern Mesopotamia, now Iraq, and at first, it looks like the battle is going very well for Cyrus. They have initial success, and Cyrus manages to spot the king, his brother Artaxerxes, on his chariot and makes a charge at him. Cyrus overextends himself and gets a javelin thrown directly into his face. His bodyguards try to protect them, but they're all cut down, and Cyrus is vanquished. Artaxerxes wins the field, except the Greeks themselves are undefeated, and the 10,000 of them are basically completely intact. But now, without their patron, they don't really know what to do. However, the generals go to representatives of the Persian king to try and negotiate a peace or a settlement, and the Greek generals are basically all massacred, leaving the Greeks in complete confusion and disarray. It's at this point that Xenophon steps up to the plate, and even though he's only a young man of 29, he decides that something has to be done, convenes a meeting, appoints new generals, and basically tries to lead the 10,000 Greeks back from southern Mesopotamia, from Babylon, all the way back to the shores of Greece. A vast exodus, and that's exactly what happens. I think the most amazing thing about Xenophon's account are some of the little vignettes, just the little snapshots into the ancient world of a kind that we don't often see. So when the men are marching through Syria, Xenophon recounts how the Syrians considered doves and fish to be sacred in their religion. Another interesting example is when the Greeks are at a certain city, when they're marching with Cyrus. Cyrus wants to impress the locals, and also the Queen of Cilicia, who apparently he's having an affair with. So the Greeks all line up, all in full panoply, with their helmets on, their shields out, their spears at the ready, and they look like a very impressive, daunting sight to all the locals. And Cyrus tells them to charge! And all the Greeks let out an enormous roar and charge at all the lined up spectators with their spears at the ready, and all the spectators flee and run away screaming, and all the Greeks burst out laughing as a result. It's such a funny moment, because I can imagine, squaddies today sort of playing a similar prank on some unsuspecting people. Another particularly moving moment is when the Greeks are in the land of the Macronians, which I believe is in modern-day Turkey, and the Macronians are the Greeks are trying to cross a river, and the Macronians are all lined up on a hill with big wicker shields and spears, shouting and cursing at the Greeks. Basically seems like they're about to attack the Greeks, until one of the men, a peltast, so a lightly armoured infantryman, who was a slave in Athens, comes up to Xenophon and says, I think that I'm in my native land, and asks permission to go and talk to them. And so he's actually a Macronian slave, who is home probably for the first time since his capture, and he goes over to the Macronians, speaks to them in their native tongue and explains that they don't want to fight, they want to be friends, and as a result the Macronians come down, start helping the Greeks, chopping down trees, helping them ford the river, and form this friendship, which is just remarkable. It's a shame that Xenophon, being an ancient person, doesn't have the same morals as us, because I feel like a modern audience wants to know what happens to that Macronian slave, and he's just never mentioned again. So whether he stayed there with the Macronians or came back to Athens, it's anyone's guess. And of course, talking about morality, there are some shocking moments in the book, and you really realise that it was a very different time. There's a lot of talk of men, sneaking back young boys and beautiful women to the camp. And also just the weirdness of their religious rites and how seriously they took it. Xenophon is always sacrificing to gods, always looking for omens, always getting himself involved in augury and haruspicy, so looking at the entrails of dead animals, looking for signs in the birds if he should attack or retreat. In one particular moment, they're being attacked by the Carduchians, who scholars often associate with the modern Kurds, and they're on the Armenian border. They're just about to cross into Armenia, but there's Armenian cavalry and troops waiting to take them. So they've got Carduchians, hostile tribesmen to their back, and hostile warriors in front of them, and they need to cross the river. But they find a place where they can ford, and because it's such a high-stakes situation, they basically do a load of sacrifices, cutting open the throats of animals, letting the blood into the river, singing these paeans, these religious songs, men wearing garlands, and sort of trying to, evoke this state of religious ecstasy. And it's bizarre. It's such a different world, but it's so fascinating. Another interesting thing is Xenophon actually goes through the old abandoned cities of Nimrod and Nineveh, these once great, beautiful, formidable capitals of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And Xenophon doesn't actually recognize what they are. He thinks they're cities built by the Medes. There's not many people there, just a few frightened locals hanging out. And I love observations like this. These imperial strongholds from 300 years prior would have been, the center of power in that part of the world, are just now mere ruins, and I guess it just shows the impermanence of all things. Certainly the most moving and inspiring moment in the whole saga is when, after trudging all the way from Babylon, up through the deserts of Mesopotamia, into the mountains of Turkey and Armenia, the valleys, the foothills, fighting through deep snows, fighting through river after river, eventually they reach the coast, they reach the Black Sea, and Xenophon hears commotion, he hears shouting going up and down the ranks, and he thinks they're under attack again, so he rides his horse all the way up to the front of the column, and, sword at the ready, thinking they're being assaulted, and then realizes the men just are shouting, the sea, and are embracing each other, weeping, and crying out with joy, because finally they've reached the sea, and finally they can sense the closeness of home. Xenophon means strange voice, by the way, and it's unclear why he was called that. Maybe as a baby he just had a really odd cry. I don't know, but that's Xenophon. Next up on the list we have Mansa Musa, a 14th century king of the Manley Empire from West Africa. Now, some historians have argued that Mansa Musa was the richest man to have ever lived. The British Museum estimates that around half of all of the gold in the entirety of the Old World was to be found in the Manley Empire of Mansa Musa. Now, he ruled in the 14th century, and his predecessor was his brother, a man called Abu Bakr. A very interesting story is told about Abu Bakr, who was apparently obsessed with finding out what was on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and so put together a massive expeditionary force of 2,000 men and sailed off west into the Atlantic, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, I'm sure there's some conspiracy theorists out there who think that maybe Abu Bakr made it to the Americas and set up settlements there, but, there's no evidence for that, as fun of a thought that might be. The thing that really immortalized Mansa Musa and made him so well known to historians is his pilgrimage. He went on the Hajj to Mecca and apparently took with him a vast moving city, 60,000 people in his baggage train. Spain, and his incredible wealth was very much on display. When he went to Cairo, him and his followers handed out so much gold that the price of gold plummeted in the Middle East, and Middle Eastern economies lost around equivalent to 1.5 billion UK pounds. They handed out that much to passers-by. This obviously made him a very popular character in Egypt at the time. Historian Al-Umari visited about 12 years after Mansa Musa had been, and the people of Cairo spoke very, very highly of him. But interestingly, there are these characters called griots, or griots, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, who are sort of like Malian troubadours, Malian singers, wandering singers, and they, to this day, can't stand Mansa Musa because they are very peeved off that he gave away so much gold outside of Mali. Apparently on his way back from the Hajj, Mansa Musa brought back several interesting people, some descendants of the Prophet, an architect from Al-Andalus, which is the Muslim part of Spain. Tradition says this guy helped design the famous Djingareba Mosque, although historians and archaeologists say that that mosque really doesn't show any signs of external foreign influence and really represents a more of a local tradition. But Mansa Musa also encouraged arts and architecture. He annexed another 24 cities to the Mali Empire. One of those cities was Timbuktu. Mansa Musa's encouragement of arts and culture and learning would be fully realised in later periods when the famous Sankore University was set up in Timbuktu, becoming a real jewel of scholarship in the Islamic world. Next on the list, we have a Roman emperor by the name of Pertinax. Pertinax was the emperor who succeeded Commodus, who many people might remember from the movie Gladiator, where he's portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix. Commodus was a pretty rubbish emperor by all accounts. He was basically deranged, obsessed with gladiatorial games, and deeply corrupt. Pertinax was quite a different sort of character. He was a decorated soldier and had served in the Parthian Wars with some distinction. He'd previously been the governor of Britain, where he'd had to deal with an army mutiny, and had served under Marcus Aurelius, everyone's favourite Stoic philosopher, in many different battles and campaigns. When Pertinax took the throne, he tried to undo a lot of the corruption and perverse decadence that had defined his predecessor Commodus's reign. However, many people argued that Pertinax went too far too quickly. He tried to do too much in too short a time. He had promised the Praetorian Guards, the bodyguards of the Roman Emperor, just lavish sums of money if they'd agreed to make him emperor, and when he was put on the throne, he couldn't make good those promises. He went after a lot of Commodus's favourites and beneficiaries, and this ended up alienating a lot of powerful people, the Praetorian Guard among the most notable. This would all culminate when 200 Praetorians showed up at Pertinax's house, demanding to see the emperor and planning to kill him. Cassius Dio actually tells us that Pertinax had enough troops with him in reserve to kill the Praetorians, to see them off. But Pertinax wasn't like that. He ventured out by himself to go and reason with the Praetorians, and as the guardsmen saw their emperor approaching, most looked bashful, looked ashamed, and began looking at the floor as the emperor tried to reason with them and lectured them on their duty to the state. However, one of the Praetorians was not interested and was not listening, and announced that he was there to kill the emperor, drew his sword, and struck Commodus down, upon which the rest of the men drew their swords, fell upon the emperor, and cut him to pieces. They chopped off his head, put it on a spear, and paraded it round the courtyard. Now, Cassius Dio asks us to think about Pertinax in this way. Was his decision to go and talk to the Praetorians brave, noble, or was it plain stupid? And Cassius Dio says, well, it's up to the reader to decide. However, it does seem that Pertinax was a good man, a noble man with good intentions, but he tried to do too much too quickly, tried to reform the state at too rapid of a pace, and paid the ultimate price for it. His posthumous reputation has been good, and he was subsequently deified by a successor emperor, Septimius Severus. However, all in all, Pertinax only reigned for a few months, and was the first emperor to reign in the year of the 5 emperors, a particularly unstable period in Roman history. Well, I hope you've been finding the names cool so far, because this one is a doozy. At number 2, we have Sheshonq the First, Egyptian pharaoh and the greatest of the Libyan pharaohs, in my estimation, and the estimation of many a scholar. Sheshonq is also sometimes called Shoshenq, so Shoshenq, Sheshonq, whatever you prefer. They both sound pretty good in my books. Essentially, why there's a discrepancy is because the Egyptians didn't write vowels in their language, they just wrote consonants, so the written form of it is like Sheshonq. So that's either Shoshenq or Sheshonq, but I think I prefer Sheshonq. Or do I prefer Shoshenq? Sheshonq, I think. Sheshonq. To understand why there were Libyans ruling Egypt in the 900s BC, you have to understand a bit of context and a bit of detail about the Bronze Age collapse, the late Bronze Age collapse, one of the most fascinating periods of history that we'll definitely be revisiting in this channel. Essentially, the Bronze Age collapse occurred for a number of reasons, although it's highly debated about. Possibly climate change, droughts, earthquakes, which precipitated mass migration of peoples, armed groups like the so-called Sea Peoples, who flooded the eastern Mediterranean, conquering, razing cities, and this caused a cascading effect, with the great civilizations of the Mycenaeans and the Hittites collapsing, those trade works collapsing, weakening the surviving civilizations like the cities of Canaan or Egypt itself. And although Egypt managed to hang on and survive this collapse, the problem was it was left in a much reduced and weakened state. It lost its empire, all of Egypt's influence in the Near East diminished, and Egypt was relegated to its traditional borders. In this context, the Libyans, who were traditional enemies of Egypt, herders from the west of Egypt in the Sahara and in modern Libya, started to move in. The Egyptian state was too fragile to defend itself, and Libyans began to settle the Nile Delta and to command more and more important positions in Egyptian society, dominating the army and making up a large part of the generals. Eventually, the Libyans would take over the role of pharaoh themselves, but the first Libyan pharaohs weren't a particularly impressive sight. The glory of the early Libyan pharaohs was really achieved only by cannibalizing the monuments and tombs of previous Egyptian monarchs. Their burials, for example, were decked out with the stolen grave goods of previous long-dead pharaohs. The Libyans also split the country in two and had a separate ruler in the north and in the south. They also tried a bit hard when they adopted Egyptian names, with taking very long and convoluted forms like, I'm going to read this, Jedkonsuiufank, which means, Khonsu said he will live. Okay. And these Libyans, many were proud of their heritage, would wear their feathers in public. Many of them had tattoos on their arms and legs and wore traditional long robes. And many of the Libyan pharaohs would retain their traditional Libyan names, like Osorkon or Sheshonq, who we're discussing today. But let's talk about Sheshonq. What did he do? Well, he really revitalized Egypt. He was the first pharaoh in hundreds of years to actually go campaigning, and he launched campaigns in Nubia, but more famously launched campaigns into Judah and Israel. Sheshonq is recorded in the Bible as Shisak and is said to have sacked Jerusalem itself. Sheshonq also reduced the use of oracles in decision-making, which had been popularized by the Libyans, and took more power into his own hands. He also made the high priest of Amun-Ra at Thebes, who was the most influential people in the country, appointed his son to that role to consolidate power of the entirety of Egypt. He also added additions to Karnak Temple, the beating religious heart of the Egyptian world. But unfortunately, Sheshonq, no matter how glorious his military achievements or his temple building or his name was, he was succeeded by losers and was a bright star who burned brightly but could not put Egypt back on solid ground. Alright, this is it. The greatest name in history, according to Matthew Chalmers from The Liberator. Who's it going to be? It's Tiglath-Pileser III. Come on. We all knew it had to be. It had to be. Tiglath-Pileser is actually his Hebrew name. His Akkadian name, his Assyrian name was actually, and I'm just going to read it, Tekulti Apple Eshara. Tiglath-Pileser, although he was actually born Pulu. I think all three of these names, Tiglath-Pileser III, Tiglath-Pileser, and Pulu, these are all great names, so, you know, triple points for this guy. So, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was the apex predator in the Near East at the time. However, when Tiglath-Pileser took the throne, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was coming out of a period of decline where local magnates had been accruing more and more power and the central government had been weakening. Previous kings by the name Tiglath-Pileser were pretty powerful and impressive folks. It was Tiglath-Pileser I who had taken the Assyrian Empire to both the shores of the Mediterranean and the shores of the Black Sea. So Tiglath-Pileser III, being a usurper who seized the throne by force, was wise to take the name Tiglath-Pileser because it gave him a lot of legitimacy, harkening back to previous stellar kings of the Assyrians. Tiglath-Pileser III was a vigorous reformer. He expanded the number of regional governors and made it so that each region was governed by two men who had to agree on policy before bringing their policy to the king to rubber stamp. He also appointed eunuchs to these roles to prevent the growth of regional dynasties which could come to threaten the dominance of the Assyrian royalty. Tiglath-Pileser III also created the world's first standing army. Prior to him, the Assyrians had relied on conscripts for soldiers during summers, but Tiglath-Pileser created a permanent force which could campaign all year round. How could it campaign all year round? Well, a major part of this was another innovation from his reign, the invention of the jackboot. Jackboots allowed soldiers to fight in any terrain, any type of weather, safely and securely. You know, deserts, mountains, cold, hot. Jackboots helped soldiers get around and made the Neo-Assyrian Empire into an even more formidable campaigning military machine. These boots revolutionized everything, making the first full-time, all-year-round army possible. And Tiglath-Pileser was a great conqueror. He went campaigning on every single year of his 17-year reign, and he took Assyrian armies to the shores of the Mediterranean. He conquered all the way down southern Mesopotamia as far as Babylon, and became crowned King Pulu of Babylon, using his birth name. Another major innovation of Tiglath-Pileser was his use of mass deportations. Now, previous Assyrian kings had deported people internally within the empire, but Tiglath-Pileser III took this to another level. By spreading groups and dividing them around the empire, not only was he able to move labour and skills to wherever they were most needed, but also split up ethnic groups in an effort to Assyrianize the different peoples of the empire, acculturating them and absorbing them into a common Assyrian identity. Tiglath-Pileser also adopted Aramaic as an administrative language for the Assyrian Empire, a language which was already spoken by a lot of the empire's inhabitants and was far more easy to learn than the difficult Akkadian cuneiform that preceded them. It was Tiglath-Pileser's reign then that made Aramaic into a new lingua franca for the Near East, and it was therefore his legacy which resulted in Aramaic being the spoken language of Jesus Christ. Well, I hope you enjoyed those 5 names. I think they're all great, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Please do like and subscribe and stick around for more content, and I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.